My name is Emily Touche, and I'm a volunteer with Equal Justice in Needham for Families. I found out about EJN when my friend Noah Mertz invited me to an open meeting in June of 2020 while I was living with my parents. And there I met Jill Olive, and we collaborated to build community around anti bias and anti racist education initiatives for families and children in our town. I believe strongly that in order to build a town where everyone is treated with respect and welcomed for who they are, we must first build that within ourselves and within our homes. Through volunteering with Equal Justice in Needham for Families, I have made many really wonderful friends, and I've also had lots of generative conversations with children, families, authors, and artists about the harmful hierarchies that exist in our society and how we can be powerful change makers to build a more inclusive future. In today's episode, we will talk about equity in schools.
Hello and welcome to Moving Forward Together with Equal Justice in Needham. I'm the show host, Massiel Gallardo. Since the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Movement, efforts have been made to identify and remedy inequitable treatment of Black, Latino, and Asian people in local town government, policing, and schools. In our show today, we will learn about the work of the Needham School Committee and staff to ensure equitable treatment for all students. But before we begin, let's review local demographics. The school demographics reflect our town's lack of diversity relative to other communities close by. In the high school, 79% of students identify as white, 9% as Asian, 6% as Latino, 5% as other, including multi-race, and 2% Black. We wonder what the schools are doing to make sure that Needham students of color feel welcome, valued, and encouraged. I would like to welcome our guest panelists today, Connie Barr, Needham School Committee, Liz Lee, Needham School Committee, and Andrea Vargas, Assistant Principal at Newman Elementary School. Welcome, everyone. Let's start with you, Liz. You were elected to school committee last year. Would you please give us a summary of the role of the school committee?
Sure, thanks, Maciel. And I will start off and then I'll turn to Connie to fill in the gaps. I am still learning. So the role of the school committee focuses on three primary areas. The first is creating policy for a district. The second is evaluating the superintendent. And the third is overseeing the budget. So in the way that I understand it, an easy way to think about it is that the school committee is kind of doing fairly broad activities, and then the school district does the operational side. So they implement things to meet the policy, for example. Connie, do you want to jump in?
I would say that we hire and evaluate the superintendent. So not only do we have the chance to share with the superintendent of the community whether our goals are being fostered and followed, but we also get to choose the person when we hire again that we think will lead the community the best, just as hiring goes on down the line. And so the other thought I had when thinking about this was all three of these give us a chance to look at things through an equity lens, who we hire and how they manage the district, what our budget priorities are. And much of our budget is pretty well established because it's the largest percentage is salaries. So we're already there, but for programs and in our attempts to hire, we have a chance to really look through an equity lens. And then policy, there again, we set overarching policy while the school district does the operations, but it's our chance to say this is what our goals are as a school committee.
Thank you, Liz and Connie. The equity audit was finished in 2018, which had recommendations for improving equity in Needham schools. What has been done in response to the audit, which showed racial disparities in Needham public schools?
I wonder if Liz might start with this because she's a member of the Real Coalition, which has really taken on the not the work, because the work is done at every level, in every classroom, in every part of the district, but the following of the recommendations of the audit so that we can move forward.
The Real Coalition is a group of educators and administrators, other staff members, and also community members who meet on a regular basis to talk about equity issues. So the Real Coalition actually is made up of 6 different sections, and each section looks at one aspect of the Needham Public School District with the idea of looking concretely at how can we achieve equity goals within that particular area. So the 6 areas are policies and practices, curriculum and instruction, professional learning, so that's on the educator side, hiring and employment, culture and climate, and then the 6th is communication and community. So at any given time, each of these 6 areas has a team that's considering each of these sort of buckets from an equity lens, looking at actions to take and then implementing them as they go forward. So that's kind of the big picture, but there are a ton of really concrete examples I can give you. So for example, we have a racial literacy curriculum, which Andrea can talk more about. We have professional development, both in the big sense and in various smaller pockets of the schools that are focused on equity and education. And then I just want to say that sometimes when people think about equity in education, they think about it as a concrete thing that you can add to what you're already doing. But actually, though I believe the way that you conceive of equity in education is equity is the foundation, and then you pull it like a thread through every piece of what you do as a school or a school district, including areas where people don't typically think there's room for equity, like the budget. But the budget is actually a moral document. If you show your community what you value by what you put in your budget and what you omit from your budget. And so in that sense, the budget then also becomes something that requires an equity lens.
Thank you, Liz. And I would like to bring into the conversation Andrea. Andrea, can you explain what equity in the schools looks like and how it's integrated into every part of education?
Like Liz said, it is impossible to describe all the efforts underway in our schools. And that's a great problem to have, that there are so many constantly happening. I think the equity report was a call to action for us all at the staff level when we heard the words of our families, and particularly our students who had experienced hardship. Being students of color, we knew we needed to do more. What does equity mean at the elementary level? I can specifically talk to that. That means that from an early age, we start having open conversations about culture and race with kids. It was previously thought young children aren't ready for those kinds of tough conversations. And we now know, the research tells us, our experiences tell us, that not only are kids open to such conversations and ready for such conversations, but they need to have them so that we can prepare kids with tools for an increasingly diverse world. And so we can really appreciate and learn from and celebrate our differences at the school level. So that may be a lot with, obviously, books. There's so many great pieces of literature now for children of all ages to immerse themselves in themes of race and culture and have rich discussions at the classroom level. But a lot of it for kids, particularly for our younger students, is really about understanding your own identity and then appreciating the identities and cultures of others. So we bring in a lot of information about family background, customs, traditions, and then maybe even feelings about current events. concerns, worries, or ideas that kids have about becoming a social activist in their own world. One of my favorite pleasures as a principal, as assistant principal, is to see kids write about things they want to change in our schools. They do persuasive letters of that nature, and teaching them to have a voice and to speak up when they see something that's wrong and empower them to fix it. That's really important work that we do here that helps our cause of equity at the elementary level.
That's wonderful to hear, Andrea. And you mentioned tools, providing tools for students, and that is great. And I wonder, what tools are teachers receiving to discuss race in schools, in our Needham schools?
That's a really important question, because we know that this can be difficult for teachers to teach. It's difficult as a parent sometimes to talk about race and the current issues facing our country. I mentioned books earlier, and I think it's the language of the books that sometimes give us a framework where we can engage with younger kids, particularly around difficult topics. So we can adopt the language as our own in order to enter into more complicated ideas. That's one of the tools. I think kids also get a chance to practice discussing differences and similarities. I think of our kindergarten racial literacy curriculum, where kids think about skin color and the differences and similarities in skin color. Well, they're discussing that in kindergarten. That conversation later on in 5th grade or beyond grows into discussing everything from traditional differences, language differences, political differences. It's important that we have the ability to honor and discuss our differences in ways that are productive and helpful to us all as a community.
I want to add on to what Andrea said, that one thing that even before I joined the school committee, I found amazing was that the district offers just a huge number of resources for teachers to learn about equity, and specifically about the teaching of equity. So there's an entire website created for the Needham Public School staff with all different sorts of teaching resources. And not only that, but the staff read books that focus on equity, both as an entire group across all grade levels, but also in smaller pockets. They may read books like Consulting for Equity, so that they can look at equity specifically in their area. For example, doing math training with elementary school, something like that.
Thank you, Liz. Andrea, I have another question. As a Needham parent, I sometimes have read in the newsletter, in the elementary school newsletter, about the Pollyanna curriculum. For parents like myself who would like to learn more about it and what it is, how is it being applied in our schools, would you mind sharing some details about the Pollyanna curriculum?
Sure. Our racial literacy curriculum is based on and adapted from the Pollyanna racial literacy curriculum, which was originally implemented in many New York City schools. When we realized we wanted more of an anti-bias and anti-racist effort at our elementary level, we looked at several different curriculums that were currently available, and this is one we found fit best. Of course, it wasn't a perfect fit. Our kids are a little different than a lot of the kids in New York, and there's some different standards for our state than there are in New York City. So this was the beginning of the Racial Literacy Task Force that I currently lead with Janine Crawford and Brooke Kessel, other colleagues of mine. And we have representatives from all 5 elementary schools and all roles in elementary schools: classroom teachers, guidance counselors, instructional coaches, etc. And together we looked through the Pollyanna racial literacy curriculum and adapted it for our use in Needham, adapted some lessons, found some other resources, paced out the expectations for teachers and which lessons we would like them to pilot in our first year and then implement in our second year. This is currently our second year. And together we've also decided on the supports and professional development that teachers would need in order to execute this curriculum successfully. So it's in its second year. It certainly has work to be done, like all of our efforts really around equity, but I think it's a step in the right direction. And it it never ceases to amaze me how great it is that our district said, this is a priority. We're going to do this. We're going to undertake this difficult work. Some districts, many districts, unfortunately, shy away from it. And our community is asking for these conversations resoundingly, and it's been very supportive of the efforts around the racial literacy curriculum in particular. We receive a lot of messages from parents thanking us for having such a program in place, and also asking if they can provide some input, and particularly when they have cultural or racial information or experience to offer to improve our program.
Thank you, Andrea. Yes, Connie.
I just wanted to say a little bit about our elementary schools give such a great foundation, starting K through 5, 6 years. Then we move into our middle and high school students, where I think what we saw this year, or we've seen over the last several years, is students taking ownership with the support of their teachers of their own interests and concerns. And so we see more movement into sexuality, into other aspects of equity. And we had at the school committee an 8th grader and a high school student came last year with the request to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, which was their own effort. And I think that builds on students' ability to recognize their own thoughts, their rights, and their energy to move something forward is something that happens in the Needham Public Schools. Needham Public Schools website, needham.k12.ma.us, and look at the equity section right in the header at the beginning of at the start of the website. There are lots of the resources and projects and what's going on there, including resources for parents.
And as a parent of biracial students, biracial children, I certainly appreciate the effort and the emphasis on representing students of color in our school curriculums, because representation does matter. So I certainly appreciate that. And, earlier I shared Needham student demographics. What can be done, though, to increase diversity of teachers in Needham? Anybody is welcome to join in.
I think this is work currently being done by our Human Resources Department, and I know Alex McNeil and others could talk a lot more in this regard, but I will tell you, as someone who is part of interview committees and often partially responsible for new hiring, I think in addition to looking for a wider pool of applicants, we've all received additional training on being culturally sensitive and maybe honestly thinking outside the box in terms of who we might hire and how we might support them and what their roles might look like. One thing that really impresses me about our district is that we always have questions, interview questions about a potential staff member's background with equity and diversity. It's a very telling question, and you might be surprised to hear how many people don't necessarily have a well-formed answer about their work with equity and education. And the people who do are the people that we really want to attract, even if we're not attracting necessarily another person of color to welcome into our schools, which is a great goal to have. We at least want to attract more people who will be behind all our efforts in terms of equity. So that's one thing. We also have a staff affinity group for staff of color. I think that's, I can't speak to that personally, but I think that's just one effort too, to say that if you are a staff person of color, you will have support and you will have a affinity from others in our district.
Thank you, Andrea.
It's a great challenge. Currently, it's a great challenge to hire anyone, largely because of our recent efforts with COVID. But the efforts have really redoubled by Alex and her group to hire diverse school staff in all ways in our school staff.
The conversation of equity in schools oftentimes leads to conversation of policing. Is the Needham Police Department involved in the schools? If so, how? Anybody is welcome to answer.
So I believe there are 2 school resource officers, and they spend time in all of the Needham Public Schools sort of equally. And the idea is to build familiarity, to build relationships between the police and the children, so that the police aren't, this group over here that kind of do their own thing, that there needs to be some comfort and some relationship there. I think that's probably the extent of my knowledge. So Andrea looks like she's ready.
Sure. Well, I think the Needham police play a very important role in our school in terms of the school resource officers, RJ and Nicole. I will say this question makes me think back to spring of 2020, upon hearing about the murders of George Floyd and others, and thinking as an educator, how are we going to help our school community through something like this when we're not even together in person? I applaud Officer RJ, for joining our Zoom call with families when we tackled this difficult subject. And I think it took incredible bravery and a willingness to learn and a willingness to be part of the problem solving with us. So I know the efforts are there from our school resource officers. I think in the news, school resource officers honestly have a really bad rap because they're used differently, frankly, in other parts of the country than they really are here. And at the elementary level, I can say, yes, in addition to bringing Rocket around and bringing joy to a lot of our kids, I would say that our school resource officers really know a lot of our families of need and have been supportive of them and communicative with, between families and teachers and school administrators so that we can have a better relationship and support kids as needed. They're not used in the elementary level at all in any kind of punitive way or any way to enforce discipline.
Yeah, I just want to thank Andrea for bringing up this idea that like the school resource officer does, you see terrible things happening in other communities, and I'm going to speak as a parent, not as a school committee member with a high schooler. My sense is that the school resource officers, obviously you need the police in general in case something terrible happens, but the school resource officers are not used for discipline. Right? Instead, that is held within educators who know the students really well and know their needs. And I just wanted to bring up that at I think, Connie, if it was our last meeting, we had Tamitha Bibbo reporting out about some of the work they're doing at Pollard. And one thing that they implemented in the last couple of years were restorative justice circles, which they're now doing across the board, I think in the entire 7th and 8th grade as part of their training. So just want to sort of pull these two ideas apart of the school resource officer and any kind of issues that schools face. They're not necessarily connected.
Thank you, Liz. And I'm glad that you mentioned restorative justice. That was going to be our next point. For parents who are not familiar with the term, what is restorative justice in terms to our schools and how is it being used or plans of being used to manage conflict?
It's been used, Andrea may be able to explain it better than I could, or Liz. It's been used for a number of years at the high school to work with what one might call misconduct or disciplinary issues as a way of a group response to victim and perpetrator, to use pretty tough words, I would say, to work through the basic reasons for something having happened and how to come out of the experience in a positive way. There are consequences to behavior, but at the same time, we can all learn about the reasons behind behavior and how a victim might feel as a result of some behavior. So that, and it's been done at they've been working on this at the high school for some time. And now, as Liz said, clearly using that at the middle school as well. I don't know if we started in elementary school or not, Andrea.
I think some elementary schools have experimented with it or have had attendees at trainings. So we're starting to focus efforts around restorative justice, but in general, we've had similar practices that focus on healing and remedying wrongdoing versus punishment or consequences in the really traditional sense that end up not solving problems as well as we would like. So yes, definitely the focus, like you said, Connie, is really on having all voices heard. Sometimes when a wrongdoing occurs around equity or in other areas, sometimes we focus a lot on the aggressor versus the victim. In restorative justice, let's say if there is a racial slur used, for instance, toward a student, the target of that racial slur will have a chance to voice why that affected them, how that affected them. And there is the hope that voice empowers them and that a healing process can begin once the aggressor realizes their actions and can make positive change in their behavior and in the surrounding community.
There is a lot of professional development available around restorative justice now. Liz is nodding. And I think we really see it as a path forward for dealing with many of the things that happen in our schools. I want to mention one other thing, and Liz has her hand up. This is what happens. We're all so interested and find this so important.
This is great conversation.
Yeah, good. Is the memorandum of understanding between our police department and our superintendent, our school district. I'm not sure all school districts have the close relationship that our superintendent has with town and safety officials in our town. And for years now, the superintendent and the chief of the police have crafted an agreement so that it is not always talking disciplinary or criminal consequences if something happens, but that our first approach is through understanding and moving toward other ways of managing conflict.
One of the things I love about restorative justice is that it gives everyone a voice, but also oftentimes, at least when I was in school, the punishment was completely different or divorced from what actually happened. And, for example, calling someone a slur would result in an expulsion or suspension, right? And there's no connection. There's no learning in that, right? It's literally just punitive, and it doesn't do the victim any good. It doesn't do the perpetrator any good unless you can actually help them see the harm that this causes. And restorative justice, as opposed to traditional disciplinary measures, allows that to happen. That's where the benefit is, I think.
This was great information. I would like to thank you all for sharing with us these great details and for speaking with us today. You gave us some great information about the Needham schools, and I appreciate it as a Needham parent. Viewers, please take a moment to fill out a poll on the EJN TV show webpage about what we covered today. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can get in touch at thishappenshereneedham@gmail.com. Until next time.